On the phone with us this morning, Congressman Tracy Mann, the big first congressman, our congressman for here in Hutchinson, though he lives in Salina. Good morning, Tracy. How are you?
I'm great, Nick. How are you this morning?
I'm doing good. So are you out east because they're in, or are you back here in Kansas today?
You know what? I had to fly back to Washington, so dropped the kids off at school yesterday in Salina, hopped a plane and in Washington, D.C. For most of the rest of the week.
That's what I thought, but sometimes these schedules, especially with legislative stuff, change a lot. That said, wanted to talk about a couple of things that have happened since the last time we spoke. One of them is a letter that was written late in January, along with Senator Marshall. You and a lot of your colleagues sent a letter to the Biden administration regarding regulation of the oil and gas industry. Gas prices here in Kansas have hovered around $3, which frankly is good relative to the rest of the nation. But what you're trying to say is, hey, listen, let's not make it worse, right?
Well, that and also, there seems like there's this war on fossil fuel for the administration right now, and they're making it difficult for our local, independent, Kansas-based oil and gas providers to drill, get permits, do what they need to do. Instead, there's been an effort to rely more on foreign oil or to switch towards electric, which is just not realistic right now. So that's what that letter was about. And it's so important, Nick, that we are advocating for our local Kansas-based oil and gas producers.
Well, and relying more on foreign oil is a difficult proposition at any time, but particularly with some of the geopolitical stuff that's going on with the Ukraine and Russia, that could change those overseas oil markets a lot, couldn't it?
That's right. It makes no sense. We're clamping down on our domestic oil and gas producers. Meanwhile, the president has asked OPEC to increase their production. That makes no sense. And then we stopped the construction, which was about done, but of the Keystone Pipeline that would bring low-cost, oil from Canada into the U.S. Meanwhile, we have provided funding and have helped the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that takes gas from Russia, bypassing Ukraine into Germany. These policies are backwards. They make no sense, the exact opposite of what, in my view, we ought to be doing.
All right. And there was a bill that basically the Democratic majority decided they were all going to get through the House that happened here since the beginning of February that, frankly, you have a lot of issues with. They called it the CONCEDES Act. You called it something else.
Oh, yeah, the CONCEDES Act. So what this came up last week. It was released on Monday. And basically, Nick, realized this is a 3,000-page bill. I guarantee that no one voted for it, read the whole thing. And what it does, it was under the guise of helping us to compete with China. It would actually weaken our position with China. So I call it the CONCEDES Act. Get this, the word coral reef is mentioned more than the word China in this legislation. This is a lot about climate initiatives. It's a lot about funding the UN. It was $325 billion. We've got to get serious about the threat that China is, but unfortunately, the joke that was last week's legislation does not do that, and that's why I do not support it.
So, I guess, what should giving China its proper place in the world look like from a U.S. perspective? It feels like to me, and I've talked kind of off the record with some other members of the Kansas delegation about this before, but as long as we are feeding them and they are providing us goods, to one degree or another, it's a symbiotic relationship. How do you keep that going while at the same time understanding some of the human rights stuff that China has done?
Yeah, well, I just think we have to realize that China is not our friend. They're our adversary. And you look at what they're doing around the world. You look at how they're unabashedly promoting their interests. You look at their human rights abuses. I think we got to acknowledge that really for the rest of this century, Nick, the debt and China are our two big adversaries. And so we got to call it for what it is. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have a good trading relationship with China. That doesn't mean that we can't import some of the products that they produce and we can't export to them, or ag products. Really frustrated to see that the phase one try to trade deal has now transitioned to phase two. But you look back over the last 2 years, and they were short $16 billion on their commitments to buy our ag products. And there's got to be accountability there. There also has to be accountability on the intellectual property that they steal and some of the things that they're doing on the world stage.
Well, what I'm trying to understand, because I've been talking to economists a lot lately, is relative to the rest of the world, because of inflation and the weaker dollar, agricultural products in Kansas are relatively cheaper when China goes to the market to decide between suppliers. So why on earth haven't they spent the money they said they would?
Well, that's the question that we're asking. So we've been raising this on the floor. We've been raising this at committee. That's exactly the question we're asking. And what is the administration's plan to work to make up that difference? Now, every indication is that, as China's economy transforms, that they are moving towards commercial hog operations, confined hog feeding, which is a good thing for us, which means they're going to need more sorghum and other commodities that we grow here. But why they've not met their commitments, those are the questions we're asking right now to try to get to the bottom of it.
Congressman, what is going on in Washington now while you're there this week that maybe Kansans should be paying attention to, at least to some degree, some of this process, particularly the bill that we were just talking about at some length? The majority party is in control of, but what's happening that people need to know about?
Well, I think big picture, the Build Back Better bill, which I strongly oppose, would start 150 new programs and cost $5 trillion over the next 10 years. It passed the House. I'm strongly opposed it, but it did pass the House. It did not pass the Senate. But now what you're going to start to see is you're going to start to see bits and pieces of that. It was 150 new programs get stuck into other pieces of legislation that's moving forward, like the CONCEDES Act last week that passed. The other thing, Nick, that you're going to see is the currently the government funding expires next week, February 18th. And so you'll see likely an extension of that. Unfortunately, there's efforts by the majority party to just keep kicking the can down the field, which is really no way to govern. We need annual budgets. We need to return to normal order in the Congress.
Okay. Forgive me, Tracy. You are the third First District congressman I have talked to about this. I talked to Jerry Moran when he was congressman before he became senator. I talked to Roger Marshall, and now I'm talking to you. And all we ever seem to talk about when it comes to budgeting, and it didn't matter who was in charge in the White House, by the way. It didn't matter which party's administration it was. We're talking about continuing resolutions and continuing resolutions and continuing resolutions. Now, I'm going to try to explain what that is, and if I get it wrong, please fix it for me, would you, Tracy? What a continuing resolution is we're going to pay all of these things plus some given percentage, but the only way that Congress has an opportunity to get people in front of them and hold them accountable, at least this is what Jerry Moran told me several years ago, is that budget process. People will come to talk to you, whether it be in hearings or personally, when their budget's on the line. That's how that accountability happens. When you do CR after CR, that doesn't happen. Is that still the way it is?
To some degree, yeah. And so what should happen is on an annual basis, the fiscal year of the government ends on September 30th every year. So, it seems like this comes up as a surprise to some people in Congress, but it happens every year. What should happen is the Appropriations Committee and all the committees submit their budgets, work out differences. The Congress agrees, the House and the Senate, signed by the President, with what the budget should be and what the spending of the government should be for the year. Now, in truth, that only happens once in a while. It did happen under the Trump administration. And so a CR is a continuing resolution. It just continues the previous budget that was in place. So instead of doing the work, coming up with a new annual budget, it just continues. Now, you could argue that if you just continued it for a year, maybe that's the right thing to do. But the continuations recently have been for just a few months. So we're looking at maybe a 3-week continuing resolution voted on later today. It makes no sense to just, extend government funding for 3 weeks. I mean, Congress needs to do its job, and this kind of haphazard budgeting is not the way we should do it, in my mind.
Well, and is part of this because, frankly, Tracy, it is an election year and people want something to fight about?
I don't know about that. I mean, potentially. But see, the budget expired September 30th of last year, which was not a budget year. This is happening because the leadership in the Congress isn't doing its job and putting forward the budgets for every one of the individual committees to then talk about, hash out, to Senator Brandt's point, to have a robust conversation about, reach agreement, and then move on. That's not happening. And so we are in this legislated by emergency, which is no way to run the country or fund the government.
Okay. Is there anything that actually is getting some bipartisan work together that isn't an emergency? Are you actually getting something accomplished for the long run, particularly when it comes to the Ag Committee? Because, obviously we aren't in a Farm Bill year yet, but that's coming up relatively soon. Well,
yeah. So the Farm Bill, comes up next year. It's a 5-year bill, expires 2023, which is the next Congress. This Congress should be having hearings, should be talking to producers, stakeholders, really listening on what's working and isn't working on this current Farm Bill. That really hasn't happened like it should. I'm optimistic it will. I've been going to the floor of the House and talking about the Farm Bill, what I'd like to see in it. Did that last week. I'm actually going to do that later on this morning because getting it right in our ag policy, critical for the big first, but it's also critical for the country, Nick. We are the free country we are, in part because we've never had to rely on another country for our food supply. We've got to get ag policy right for a whole host of reasons, and we're working to provide leadership and do all that we can do to make sure that happens.
Well, and that swings back to the China topic we talked about before, doesn't it, Tracy?
That's exactly right. That's spot on. So a lot of these things are interconnected. End of the day, the world's a better place when America is exhibiting strong leadership. And we're not seeing that over the last few months. We saw what happened in Afghanistan weakened our position. Those kind of things have consequences. So it's emboldened Vladimir Putin in Russia as we're looking at potentially a takeover and invasion of Ukraine and other bad actors around the world.
All right, Tracy, if folks need help from your office, how can they get it?
Yeah, just go to our website, man.house.gov. Sign up for our newsletter to learn more, or call our office anytime. I have an office in Dodge, one in Manhattan. Of course, I live in Salina, but could call our D.C. office as well. We're going to have a telephone town hall meeting tomorrow night, 6 o'clock Central Time. So folks will get phone calls about that. If you want to join that, just call my office, 202-225-2715, and we can make sure to get you information on that as well, or go to our website.